The calm before the storm. It was a serene morning in the small town of Brookhaven. The sun bathed the streets in a warm golden glow, and the air was fresh with the crisp scent of early autumn. The sidewalks of Main Street were bustling with the hum of daily life. Locals sipped their coffees on outdoor cafe patios, exchanged pleasantries, and enjoyed the peaceful rhythm of another uneventful day. Among the townsfolk, Michael Harding sat quietly at his favorite spot outside the coffee nook. Every morning, he came to this small cafe to enjoy a latte and feel the comforting sounds of life buzzing around him. Beside him, sitting upright with an alert posture, was Scout, his loyal German shepherd. To the untrained eye, Scout appeared to be just another guide dog, his harness marking him as a companion for Michael, who had been blind since a tragic accident in his early 20s. But Scout was far more than that. Scout had a history, one etched with dedication and courage. He was a retired K-9 unit, having served alongside officers in some of the most dangerous situations. Scout was highly trained, loyal to a fault, and attuned to threats in ways that Michael had come to depend on. Despite his years of service, Scout now lived a calmer life, acting as Michael's eyes and protector. Michael adjusted his scarf as a breeze picked up, ruffling Scout's fur. "Smells like fall's really here, doesn't it, buddy?" he said, his hand brushing the dog's head. Scout responded with a soft nudge, his eyes scanning the crowd. Always vigilant, the dog never relaxed entirely. His duty now was to protect Michael, and Scout took it as seriously as any mission he'd ever been on. The peaceful moment was interrupted by the distant growl of engines. 3 motorcycles roared down the street, their thunderous presence breaking the quiet harmony of the morning. Heads turned as the bikes rolled up and parked near the cafe. The riders dismounted, their black leather jackets adorned with bold patches that marked them as members of a local motorcycle club. They carried themselves with a swagger that demanded attention, their laughter loud and sharp as they surveyed the cafe patio. Michael, oblivious to the commotion, continued sipping his latte, but Scout's ears perked up immediately. The German shepherd stiffened, his sharp eyes locking onto the newcomers. Something about their demeanor unsettled him. Scout didn't growl. He never did unless absolutely necessary. But the tension in his body was palpable. The leader of the group, a tall man with a thick beard and a cocky grin, sauntered over. His name was Jax, and he radiated a confidence that bordered on arrogance. His companions, less imposing but equally brash, followed a few steps behind. Jax's gaze landed on Scout. "Well, would you look at that?" he said loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "That's one big dog. Bet he's just a big old teddy bear, huh?" He grinned, his tone mocking. His friends chuckled, their laughter grating in the quiet space. Scout didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on Jax, unblinking. The German shepherd's stillness was unnerving if you understood the language of dogs, but Jax either didn't notice or didn't care. He leaned down slightly, his grin widening. "What's his name?" Jax asked, addressing Michael directly. Michael, unaware of Jax's intentions, smiled politely. "His name is Scout. He's my guide dog." "Scout, huh? Sounds tough," Jax replied. "You think he's as smart as he looks?" Michael nodded. "Smarter." Jax chuckled and turned to his friends. "Smarter, huh? Let's see about that." He reached a hand toward Scout, a motion that seemed harmless enough to the untrained eye. But for Scout, it was a clear provocation. The German shepherd's head tilted slightly, his eyes narrowing. He didn't growl, didn't snap, but the message was clear. Back off. Michael felt the tension through the leash and placed a calming hand on Scout's head. "Easy, Scout," he murmured. Jack smirked, pulling his hand back. "Touchy, aren't we?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. His friends laughed again, but their amusement carried an edge of nervousness. Around them, the cafe patrons watched uneasily. Some exchanged glances, and a few discreetly pulled out their phones, sensing that the situation might escalate. Michael shifted in his chair, sensing the unease in Scout's body. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. Jack straightened, his smirk fading slightly. "No problem," he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Just admiring your dog, that's all." But even as he said it, there was a glint in his eyes that Scout didn't trust. The German shepherd's gaze never left Jack's, his body coiled like a spring ready to snap. Jax lingered for a moment longer before stepping back to rejoin his friends. "Come on, let's grab a table," he said, his tone casual. But as they moved away, his laughter carried a sharp undertone, as though the interaction had been some kind of game to him. Scout remained tense, his eyes tracking the bikers as they settled at a table a few yards away. Michael, sensing his companion's unease, stroked his fur gently. "It's okay, Scout," he murmured. "We're fine." But Scout didn't relax. His instincts, honed through years of training, told him that the threat wasn't over. Across the patio, Jax glanced back at Michael and Scout, his expression unreadable. Whatever game he thought he was playing, it wasn't finished. And Scout, ever the protector, knew it. The spark ignites. The afternoon sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the patio of the coffee nook. The once bustling cafe was now quieter, with only a few patrons lingering over their drinks. Michael finished the last sip of his latte, savoring the rich flavor. Scout, still sitting beside him, remained on edge. His ears twitched at every noise, and his sharp eyes were locked on the trio of bikers seated a few tables away. The air seemed charged with tension. Though Michael couldn't see Jax and his friends, he could feel the weight of their presence. Their voices, loud and laced with mocking tones, reached him even from a distance. Scout's leash felt taut in Michael's hand. The dog's body coiled and ready. Jax leaned back in his chair, his arms draped lazily over the backrest, but his eyes never left Scout. He nudged one of his friends, a wiry man with a nervous laugh named Trent. "You see that dog? All business. Bet he doesn't even know how to have fun," Jack said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Trent chuckled awkwardly. "Yeah, man. Real serious. Probably thinks he's still a cop or something." "Exactly," Jack said, his grin widening. "What do you say we loosen him up a bit?" Trent and the third biker, a burly man nicknamed Ringo, exchanged uneasy glances. "Come on, Jax," Ringo muttered. "He's just a blind guy with a dog. Let it go." But Jax wasn't the type to back down. His ego, bruised by Scout's earlier warning, demanded satisfaction. "Relax, it's just a bit of fun," he said, standing up. "No harm done." Jack sauntered over to Michael's table again, his heavy boots thudding against the pavement. Michael turned his head slightly, his other senses picking up the man's approach. Scout's body tensed further, his lips pulling back in a silent snarl. "Still here, huh?" Jack said, his voice casual but with an undercurrent of malice. "Didn't mean to spook your dog earlier. Thought maybe he'd want to meet a friendly face." Michael smiled faintly, his grip tightening on Scout's leash. "Scout's not spooked. He's just protective." "Protective, huh?" Jax crouched slightly, bringing himself closer to Scout's level. "Well, let's see just how protective he is." Before Michael could respond, Jax reached out, not toward Michael, but toward Scout. It was a calculated move, a quick flick of the hand near the dog's face. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like a harmless gesture, but to Scout, it was a deliberate challenge. The German shepherd's reaction was immediate. He let out a low guttural growl, his body shifting to place himself between Jax and Michael. His sharp eyes locked onto Jax's hand, a silent warning that needed no translation. "Whoa, easy there, boy," Jax said with a smirk, pulling his hand back. "Guess he's not much for making new friends." Michael, sensing the escalation, spoke up. "I don't know what you're trying to do, but I'd appreciate it if you left us alone." Jax's smirk widened. "Relax, buddy. I'm just messing around. No harm, no foul." Scout didn't move, his posture rigid and unyielding. The growl in his throat grew louder, drawing the attention of nearby patrons. A couple sitting at a table a few feet away whispered to each other, their eyes darting between Jax and Scout. "Look, man," Michael said, his voice firm. "Scout's trained to protect me. If you keep provoking him, you're going to regret it." Jax straightened, his grin faltering for a moment, but the glances from his friends and the murmurs of the onlookers spurred him on. He couldn't back down now, not in front of an audience. "Oh, I'm not scared of a dog," he said, taking a step back, but his tone carried less confidence than before. "Maybe you should be," a voice interjected. The words came from a woman seated at a nearby table. She stood up, her sharp eyes glaring at Jax. Her name was Sarah, a regular at the cafe who often exchanged pleasantries with Michael. Today, she wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. "Leave him alone," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "You're not funny, and you're not welcome here." Jax's head snapped toward her, his expression darkening. "Mind your business, lady," he snapped. Sarah didn't flinch. "This is my business. You're harassing a man and his service dog. You should be ashamed." The confrontation drew more attention. Phones were out now, patrons filming the exchange. Jax noticed this and hesitated, his bravado flickering. "Fine," he muttered, throwing up his hands. "I was just leaving anyway." He turned and walked back to his table, his movements stiff with frustration. His friends exchanged uneasy glances, but followed him without a word. The trio mounted their bikes, the engines roaring to life. But before Jax put on his helmet, he cast one last look at Michael and Scout, his eyes burning with unspoken intent. Michael felt Scout relax slightly as the roar of the motorcycles faded into the distance. He exhaled a shaky breath, running a hand through the dog's fur. "Good boy, Scout," he murmured. "Good boy." Sarah approached the table, her expression softening. "Are you okay, Michael?" He nodded. "Thanks for stepping in." Scout handled most of it, though. Sarah glanced at the spot where the bikers had been. "That guy. He's trouble. You should be careful." Michael gave a small smile. "I got Scout. I'll be fine." But as Sarah returned to her seat and the cafe resumed its normal rhythm, Scout remained vigilant. He sat beside Michael, his eyes scanning the street, his instincts telling him that the encounter was far from over. And he was right. Somewhere down the road, Jax was already planning his next move. A brewing storm. The streets of Brookhaven grew quieter as the evening approached. The golden sunlight faded into a muted orange, casting long shadows across the small town. Michael walked home from the cafe, his pace steady and sure, with Scout guiding him effortlessly. Though the air was cool and the neighborhood was calm, an unshakable unease lingered in Michael's chest. Scout had been unusually tense all afternoon, and his behavior at the cafe earlier only added to Michael's concern. "Something's got you rattled, huh, buddy?" Michael murmured, gripping Scout's leash firmly. The dog glanced up at him briefly, his sharp eyes softening for a moment before returning to their vigilant scan of their surroundings. Scout's pace was brisk, his ears twitching at every sound, his posture signaling that he was ready for anything. Michael trusted Scout implicitly, but the tension in the dog's movements was unnerving. When they reached Michael's modest apartment, Scout pushed his way inside first, his large frame blocking the doorway as he surveyed the room. Only after a few moments did he step aside to let Michael in. Michael chuckled softly. "Always the professional, aren't you?" He knelt to ruffle Scout's fur, but the dog barely acknowledged the gesture, his focus fixed on the door. Michael sighed and set about his evening routine. He unclipped Scout's leash and poured water into the dog's bowl, but Scout only took a few laps before returning to his spot by the door. His ears were perked, and his body was tense, every muscle ready to spring into action. Michael noticed. "You're making me nervous, Scout," he said, his tone half joking, but edged with genuine worry. "What is it? Something I should know." Scout didn't respond, of course, but his behavior spoke volumes. He didn't relax, didn't lie down, didn't even wag his tail. Instead, he stared at the door, his sharp eyes unblinking, as if daring whatever threat he sensed to make itself known. Michael sat on the couch, running his fingers over the smooth leather of Scout's harness. The events at the cafe replayed in his mind: the bikers, Jax's taunts, Scout's unwavering vigilance. He frowned, his fingers tightening on the harness. Something about Jax had felt wrong. And Scout, with his finely tuned instincts, had clearly picked up on it too. The evening passed slowly. Michael tried to distract himself with the audiobook he'd been listening to, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Even the faint hum of motorcycles in the distance, a common sound in Brookhaven, set his nerves on edge. At one point, he called Scout over, trying to comfort the dog as much as himself. "Come on, boy," he said, patting the couch beside him. "It's just us here. We're safe." Scout approached, his steps measured and deliberate. He rested his head briefly on Michael's knee, but his eyes never left the door. His ears twitched at every faint noise from outside, and his breathing was steady but alert. Even as Michael stroked his fur, Scout remained on edge, his body coiled like a spring. It was nearing midnight when the sound came, a faint noise at first, just a soft scrape, barely audible. Michael paused, his head tilting as he tried to place the sound. Scout was on his feet instantly, his body rigid, and his ears perked. The scrape came again, this time louder, followed by the faint rustle of movement just outside the apartment. Michael's heart began to race. He grabbed Scout's harness, holding on tightly as he whispered, "What is it, boy? Someone out there?" Scout let out a low growl, the sound rumbling deep in his chest. It wasn't a bark. Scout never barked without reason, but it was a clear warning, a sound that sent chills down Michael's spine. The German shepherd's eyes were fixed on the door, his body poised for action. Michael reached for his phone, fumbling slightly as his fingers trembled. He dialed 911, his voice steady but urgent as he spoke to the dispatcher. "I think someone's outside my apartment," he said, keeping his tone low. "I'm blind, but my dog, he's trained, and he's never acted like this before." The dispatcher assured him that officers were on their way, but the minutes felt like hours. The sounds outside grew louder. Footsteps, muffled voices, the occasional scrape against the window. Scout's growl deepened, and he positioned himself directly between Michael and the door. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, a deliberate knock on the door that made Michael jump. Scout barked sharply, a single, commanding sound that reverberated through the small apartment. Michael tightened his grip on the dog's harness, his heart pounding. "Who is it?" Michael called out, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. A voice responded, deep and mocking. "Relax, man. It's just me, Jax." Michael's blood ran cold. He didn't need to see to know that Jax's presence spelled trouble. Scout's growl became a snarl, his teeth bared as he stood protectively in front of Michael. The dog's body was a solid wall of muscle and resolve, ready to defend his owner at all costs. "What do you want?" Michael demanded, his voice firmer now. "You need to leave." Outside, Jax laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Just wanted to chat. Didn't mean to scare you." Michael didn't believe him for a second. "I've already called the police," he said, hoping the warning would be enough. "They're on their way." Jax's laugh faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "No need for that, man. I'm just here to make sure there's no hard feelings." Scout barked again, louder this time, and Michael could feel the dog's body trembling with tension. He reached out, his hand resting on Scout's back in an attempt to calm him. But Scout was beyond comfort. He was in full protection mode, every instinct on high alert. The sound of sirens in the distance finally broke the standoff. Jax cursed under his breath, and Michael heard the sound of retreating footsteps. The tension in the room didn't lift until the sirens grew louder, and the flashing lights of a patrol car illuminated the apartment. Michael exhaled shakily, loosening his grip on Scout's harness. "Good boy," he murmured, his voice soft with relief. "You did good, Scout." The police arrived moments later, their presence a welcome relief. But as Michael recounted the events of the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Jax had backed off for now, but Michael knew that someone like him wouldn't let things go so easily. As the officers left and the apartment grew quiet once more, Scout remained vigilant, his eyes fixed on the door. Michael sat on the edge of the couch, his hand resting on the dog's head. "We'll be ready, won't we, Scout?" he said softly. The dog didn't wag his tail, didn't relax. Instead, he stood his ground, a silent sentinel, ready to face whatever came next. The chase in the shadows. The next morning dawned quietly, as if the night's tension had been erased by the golden rays of the sun. But Michael felt far from calm. He hadn't slept well, his thoughts swirling with memories of Jax's menacing presence outside his apartment. Scout had been equally restless, patrolling the apartment like a soldier on duty. Even now, as Michael prepared for the day, Scout stayed close, his sharp eyes flicking toward every sound from the street. Michael sighed as he clipped Scout's harness. "Ready for another day, Scout? Let's hope it's quieter than yesterday." The German shepherd gave no response beyond a slight wag of his tail, his body still taut with readiness. They stepped out into the crisp morning air, the cool breeze a stark contrast to the suffocating tension of the previous night. The streets of Brookhaven bustled with their usual morning energy, cars humming by, shopkeepers arranging displays, and children chattering on their way to school. For a moment, it seemed like just another ordinary day. But Scout didn't relax. His ears twitched at every unusual sound, his nose sniffing the air as they walked down the familiar route to the coffee nook. Michael trusted Scout's instincts implicitly, and his behavior only heightened Michael's unease. When they reached the cafe, Michael found his usual table outside, settling into the comforting routine of ordering his latte. Scout sat beside him, his posture rigid and alert. Michael ran his hand over the dog's fur, hoping to calm him. "What's got you so worked up, Scout?" "It's just another morning." But Scout didn't seem to think so. His gaze darted toward the street, his muscles tensing as if ready to spring into action. Michael felt the leash tighten slightly in his hand. Then came the unmistakable sound, a low rumble that grew steadily louder. Motorcycles. Michael's heart sank as the noise drew closer, the memory of Jax's mocking laughter flashing through his mind. He gripped Scout's leash tightly. The motorcycles came into view, their riders clad in leather jackets that gleamed in the morning sun. It was Jax and his crew, cruising down the street like kings of the road. As they approached the cafe, the roar of their engines drew the attention of every patron on the patio. Conversation stopped, and heads turned. Scout stiffened beside Michael, his sharp eyes locking onto the riders. Michael could feel the tension radiating through the leash. "Stay with me, Scout," he murmured. The motorcycles slowed as they passed the cafe, Jax's piercing gaze scanning the tables. When his eyes landed on Michael and Scout, his lips curled into a smirk. He revved his engine, the deafening roar a deliberate provocation, before the group rode on. Michael let out a shaky breath as the noise faded. Scout, however, remained on edge, his eyes fixed on the street where the bikers had disappeared. "That guy again?" a familiar voice asked. Michael turned his head toward Sarah, who had just arrived at the cafe. She placed her hand on Scout's back, her touch gentle but firm. "I saw the way he looked at you. He's not done with whatever he's planning." Michael nodded, his jaw tight. "I know. Scout knows too." Sarah pulled up a chair. "You need to be careful. Men like him don't back down easily. They see every challenge as an opportunity to prove something." Michael stroked Scout's fur absently. "I don't want trouble, Sarah. I just want to live my life." Sarah's expression softened. "I know, Michael, But trouble has a way of finding you when you least expect it. As they spoke, Scout's ears perked, and he let out a low growl. Michael felt the vibration through the leash and immediately tensed. "What is it, Scout?" he asked, his voice low. Sarah followed the dog's gaze. Across the street, a figure lingered in the shadows of an alley. It was Jack's. He was leaning against a wall, watching them intently. His posture was casual, but the look in his eyes was anything but. "He's here," Sarah whispered. Michael's grip on the leash tightened. "What's he doing?" "Nothing. Just watching," Sarah said, her voice tinged with unease. Scout growled again, his body coiled like a spring. Michael knew he needed to leave. "Come on, Scout," he said, standing. "Let's go." Sarah stood too. "I'll walk with you." They started down the street, Scout leading the way with his usual precision. Michael's heart raced as he tried to maintain his calm exterior. Behind them, the faint sound of boots on pavement reached his ears. He didn't need Scout's growl to know they were being followed. "Jax is coming," Sarah said under her breath. Michael quickened his pace. Let's not give him a reason to escalate. But Jax had other plans. "Hey, buddy," he called out, his voice mocking. "Leaving so soon? We didn't even get a chance to catch up." Michael ignored him, focusing on Scout's steady movements. The German shepherd's tension was palpable, his growls low and continuous. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Jax shouted, his footsteps quickening. Sarah turned to face him. "Leave him alone, Jax. Haven't you done enough?" Jax ignored her, his attention fixed on Michael. "Come on, man. I just want to talk." Michael stopped abruptly, his jaw clenched. "You've got nothing to say that I want to hear," he said, his voice firm. Jax smirked. "Oh, I think you'll want to hear this." He stepped closer, but before he could get too close, Scout moved between them, his teeth bared and a deep guttural growl rumbling from his chest. Jax froze, his smirk faltering. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "Easy, boy," he said, raising his hands. "No need to get all worked up." Michael stood tall, his hand on Scout's harness. "Scout doesn't like bullies, and neither do I. Walk away, Jax." The tension hung thick in the air, but before Jax could respond, the distant sound of a police siren cut through the silence. He glanced down the street, his expression darkening. "This isn't over," he muttered before turning and walking away. Michael exhaled, his grip on Scout's leash loosening slightly. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "You handled that well." Michael shook his head. "It's not over. He's not the type to let things go." Scout growled softly, his eyes fixed on the direction Jax had gone. Michael stroked his fur, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "We'll be ready, Scout. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." The day felt heavier as they walked home, shadows lengthening around them. Michael knew this was only the beginning, and Scout's unwavering vigilance was the only reassurance he had. The trap is set. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the small town of Brookhaven in deep shades of amber and crimson. The quiet streets, which usually brought Michael comfort, felt eerie tonight. Each step echoed too loudly in his ears as he and Scout made their way home from a day marked by unease. The sharp, rhythmic click of Scout's nails on the pavement was the only sound Michael trusted. Scout's body was rigid with tension. He sniffed the air more frequently than usual, his ears swiveling toward faint noises that Michael couldn't hear. Michael tightened his grip on the leash. "What's wrong, boy? You haven't been this worked up since last night." Scout didn't respond with a wag or a comforting nudge. Instead, he let out a low growl that sent a chill down Michael's spine. The German shepherd's instincts were never wrong. Something was off. As they approached Michael's apartment, Scout stopped abruptly, his body blocking the path. Michael frowned, his free hand reaching out to feel for obstacles. "What is it, Scout?" The dog's growl deepened, his eyes fixed on the shadows ahead. Michael strained his ears, and then he heard it, the faint scrape of boots on asphalt. Someone was following them. Michael's pulse quickened. He adjusted his grip on Scout's harness and turned his head slightly, as if trying to locate the source of the sound. "Who's there?" Michael called out, his voice steady but edged with tension. The street remained silent, the shadows unmoving. Scout growled again, his body coiling like a spring ready to launch. Michael knew better than to doubt his companion. "Let's go, Scout," he said, his voice low. He turned toward a side street, choosing a less direct route home, in the hopes of throwing off whoever might be following them. The detour led them through a small park, its paths dimly lit by scattered street lamps. The trees cast long, spindly shadows that seemed to move with every breeze. Scout's growls grew softer but more frequent, his tension palpable through the leash. Michael's heart pounded as he tried to maintain his composure. Halfway through the park, a voice broke the silence. "Out for a stroll, are we?" Michael froze. He recognized the voice instantly. "Jax." "Leave us alone," Michael said firmly, his grip on Scout's harness tightening. Jax chuckled, the sound sending a wave of anger through Michael. "Relax, man. Just wanted to talk. You've been making me look bad, and I don't take kindly to that." Scout barked sharply, his stance shifting as he positioned himself between Michael and the voice. Michael felt a surge of gratitude for the dog's unwavering loyalty. "You've been following us," he said. "What do you want?" The sound of Jax's boots grew louder as he stepped closer. "What I want is for you to learn your place," he said, his tone laced with menace. "You think you're untouchable because you've got a dog. Let's see how tough he really is." Michael felt Scout's muscles tense further, his growls turning into a steady rumble. "You don't want to do this," Michael warned. "Scout's trained for situations like this. You won't win." Jax laughed, the sound grating. "We'll see about that." Suddenly, there was movement all around them. Michael's ears picked up the sound of more footsteps, heavy, deliberate. Jax hadn't come alone. He had brought backup. Scout's growl turned into a series of sharp barks as he turned his head, tracking the sounds. "Come on, man," Jax said mockingly. "You didn't think I'd take you on solo, did you?" Michael's mind raced. He couldn't see the men surrounding them, but Scout could. The dog's body turned slightly, his sharp barks signaling multiple threats. Michael reached into his pocket for his phone, his fingers trembling as he fumbled to call for help. "Don't bother," Jax said, as if reading his mind. "By the time anyone gets here, it'll be over." Michael clenched his jaw, his grip on Scout's leash so tight his knuckles turned white. "If you touch me or my dog, you'll regret it," he said, his voice unwavering despite the fear coursing through him. Jax stepped closer, his voice low and menacing. "I'm not afraid of a blind guy and his mutt." Scout reacted instantly. The German shepherd lunged forward, stopping just short of Jax, but snapping his jaws with a force that made the air crackle. Jax stumbled back, cursing. The sound of Scout's growl was primal, a warning no one could ignore. "You think that mutt's going to scare me?" Jax spat, but his voice betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. Michael's hand found the emergency button on his phone, and he pressed it. The faint sound of the automated dispatcher confirming the call brought a shred of relief. "Help is on the way," Michael said. "You can walk away now, or you can wait and explain this to the cops." Jax hesitated, his bravado faltering as Scout took another step forward, his growls relentless. Around them, the other men shifted uneasily. They hadn't expected this, a blind man standing his ground with a dog that was clearly more than just a pet. The sound of sirens in the distance cut through the tension. Jax cursed under his breath. "This isn't over," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You think a dog and some cops are going to protect you. You've made an enemy tonight." Michael stood tall, his hand resting on Scout's head. "I don't need to make threats, Jax. I have Scout. That's all I need." Jax glared at them for a moment longer before barking an order to his men. Let's go. The footsteps retreated, the sound fading into the distance. Scout's growls softened but didn't stop entirely. Even as the flashing lights of a police car approached, he remained on high alert. The officers arrived moments later, their presence a welcome relief. Michael recounted the encounter, his voice steady but laced with exhaustion. Scout stayed by his side, his body pressed against Michael's leg, as if to reassure him. "You did good, Scout," Michael murmured as the officers swept the area. "You always do." But even as they walked home under the watchful eyes of the police, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Jax's parting words echoed in his mind, a chilling promise that lingered like a storm on the horizon. As they entered the apartment, Scout immediately resumed his vigilant patrol of the space. Michael sat on the edge of the couch, his hand resting on the dog's strong shoulders. "Whatever comes next, we'll be ready," he said softly. Scout didn't wag his tail or relax. He simply stared at the door, his eyes sharp and unyielding. He understood the danger wasn't gone. It was waiting, biding its time. And when it came, Scout would be ready. Michael sat on the edge of the couch for a while, replaying the events in his mind. The adrenaline that had kept him steady during the encounter with Jax and his gang was beginning to wear off, leaving behind a weighty exhaustion. Yet he knew this was no time to relax. Scout, still on high alert, paced the apartment in tight, deliberate circles, his sharp ears twitching at every creak and groan of the building. Michael reached out to where Scout was patrolling, his hand brushing the German shepherd's flank as the dog passed. "Come here, boy," he said softly. Scout paused, turning his intelligent gaze toward Michael before stepping close. The dog sat down beside him, his muscles still tense, his ears still perked. Michael ran his fingers through Scout's thick fur, finding comfort in the steady rhythm of his breathing. "You've always been my protector," Michael murmured. "Ever since the day we met, I knew you'd keep me safe. Tonight just proves that again." Scout leaned into him slightly, his watchful eyes never leaving the door. The faint buzz of Michael's phone broke the moment. He reached into his pocket, retrieving the device with one hand while keeping the other on Scout. The caller ID displayed a number he didn't recognize, but something in his gut told him to answer. "Hello," Michael said cautiously. For a moment, there was silence on the other end, followed by a low, mocking laugh. Michael's heart sank. "You really think a couple of cops and a dog are going to keep you safe forever?" Jax's voice oozed through the phone, his tone dripping with malice. "You don't know who you're messing with." Michael's grip tightened on the phone. "Jax, you've already crossed the line. Stay away from me and my dog, or I'll make sure the police get more than just a report next time." Jax chuckled again, the sound infuriatingly calm. "You're brave, I'll give you that. But bravery won't stop what's coming. This isn't over, not by a long shot." Before Michael could respond, the call ended abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of Scout growling softly at his side. Michael put the phone down, his hand shaking slightly. He rubbed Scout's neck, feeling the tension in the dog's taut muscles. "He's trying to scare us, Scout. That's all this is. We're not going to let him win." Scout's growl deepened, his eyes fixed on the door. He stood up, his tail rigid, and moved to the window. Michael followed his movements, his own senses heightened by the dog's unrelenting vigilance. The street outside was quiet now, the earlier sounds of the motorcycles long gone. Still, Scout stood at the window, his body a silent sentinel against any unseen threats. Michael trusted him completely, knowing that Scout's instincts were sharper than his own. Hours passed in uneasy silence. Michael sat in his favorite armchair, his fingers absently running over Scout's leash. Despite the exhaustion weighing on him, he couldn't bring himself to go to bed. He felt vulnerable in a way he hadn't since losing his sight, and it gnawed at him like an unrelenting itch. Scout, too, refused to rest. The German shepherd patrolled the apartment with quiet determination, occasionally returning to Michael's side to nudge his leg, as if reminding him that he wasn't alone. Finally, Michael couldn't take the tension any longer. He reached for his phone and called Sarah. Her steady voice answered on the second ring. "Michael, are you okay?" she asked, concern evident in her tone. "I'm fine," Michael replied, though he knew his voice betrayed his lingering unease. I thought I heard something outside, and I can't shake this feeling. Do you want me to come over?" Sarah offered without hesitation. Michael hesitated. He didn't want to put her in danger, but the thought of having another person there, even for a little while, was comforting. "If you're sure," he said finally. "Give me 10 minutes," Sarah said. "I'll bring some coffee." Michael managed a small smile. "Thanks, Sarah." When the call ended, Michael leaned back in his chair, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. Scout, sensing the shift in his mood, patted over and rested his head on Michael's knee. "She'll be here soon," Michael murmured, stroking Scout's fur. "And with you here, I know we'll be okay." Scout wagged his tail once but didn't relax completely. His ears remained perked, his body ready to spring into action at the slightest sign of danger. The faint sound of footsteps outside the apartment made Michael tense. Scout's head snapped toward the door, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Michael stood, his hand gripping the dog's harness tightly. "Sarah," Michael called out, his voice steady but questioning. There was no answer. Scout growled louder, his body pressing against Michael's leg as he positioned himself between his owner and the door. Michael's pulse quickened, his free hand reaching for his phone. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and for a moment, all was silent. Then came a loud knock. Scout barked sharply, the sound echoing through the apartment like a gunshot. Michael's grip on the harness tightened as he called out again, his voice firm. "Who's there?" This time, the voice that answered wasn't Sarah's. It was deep, mocking, and all too familiar. "It's me," Jack said, his tone filled with dark amusement. "Just wanted to drop by and say hello." The showdown. Michael's heart pounded as the knock reverberated through the apartment again. Scout stood in front of him, his body coiled like a spring, growling deeply. The sound was primal, a stark warning to anyone foolish enough to challenge him. Michael tightened his grip on Scout's harness, forcing himself to take a steadying breath. "Jax, I already called the police," Michael said firmly, his voice carrying a sharp edge. "You're trespassing. Leave now." On the other side of the door, Jax chuckled, the sound dripping with menace. "You think the cops scare me? They'll show up, take a statement, and leave. But me? I'm not going anywhere." Scout barked sharply, the sound so forceful it made Michael flinch. The German shepherd's message was clear. One more step, and I won't hesitate. Michael reached for his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed 911. The dispatcher answered quickly, their voice calm and professional. 911, what's your emergency? "There's a man outside my apartment," Michael said, keeping his voice low but steady. "His name is Jax. He's harassing me, and he won't leave. I'm blind, but my dog is trained for protection. He's ready to act if necessary." "We're dispatching officers to your location now," the dispatcher assured him. "Stay on the line." Jax must have heard Michael's voice through the door, because his tone shifted, becoming more aggressive. "You're hiding behind your dog and your phone, aren't you? That mutt isn't going to save you." Michael gritted his teeth. "Scout isn't just a dog. He's smarter than you'll ever be, and he'll do whatever it takes to protect me." Jax banged on the door, the sound making Scout's growls escalate. "Let's see about that," Jax snarled. From behind the door, Michael could hear the faint shuffling of feet. Jax wasn't alone. The realization made his stomach drop. He tightened his grip on Scout's leash, bracing himself for whatever came next. A loud crash shattered the tense silence as the doorframe splintered. Jax and his gang were trying to break in. Michael felt Scout lunge forward slightly, his growls turning into sharp, menacing barks that filled the apartment. "Back off," Michael shouted, his voice firm. "You don't know what you're dealing with." But Jax didn't stop. The door creaked under the pressure of their attempts, and Michael knew it wouldn't hold much longer. He crouched slightly, his hand gripping Scout's harness tightly. "Scout, stay," Michael commanded. The dog obeyed, though his body trembled with anticipation, his sharp eyes fixed on the door. The next few moments felt like an eternity. Michael could hear the dispatcher on the phone, calmly relaying updates to the officers en route. But it wasn't fast enough. The door gave way with a deafening crash, the sound of splintering wood echoing through the apartment. Jax stepped inside, his tall frame dominating the doorway. Behind him, two of his gang members followed, their faces obscured by the dim lighting. Jax smirked, his eyes glinting with malice. "Not so tough now, are you?" he sneered. Scout didn't wait for a command. The instant Jax crossed the threshold, the German shepherd launched himself forward with a speed and precision that left no room for hesitation. His powerful body collided with Jax, knocking him backward into the hallway. Jax yelled in shock, his hands flailing as he tried to regain his balance. The other two men froze, their bravado faltering as Scout turned his attention to them. The dog's sharp bark and bared teeth were enough to make them hesitate. Michael stood firm, his hand on Scout's harness as he called out, "You've made a mistake coming here. Get out before it's too late." One of the men lunged toward Scout, but the German shepherd was ready. He snapped at the man's hand, forcing him to retreat with a shout of pain. Scout positioned himself between Michael and the intruders, his growls resonating like a warning bell. Jax staggered to his feet, his face twisted in anger. "You think this dog is going to stop me?" he snarled. Scout's growl deepened, his sharp eyes locked on Jax. The tension in the room was electric, every muscle in Scout's body primed for action. Suddenly, the faint sound of sirens pierced the air. The flashing lights of police cars illuminated the street outside, casting a red and blue glow into the apartment. Jax cursed under his breath, his bravado crumbling as the reality of the situation sank in. "Cops are here," one of the men muttered, his voice trembling. "We need to go." But Jax wasn't ready to back down. He took a step toward Michael, his fists clenched. Scout lunged forward again, his powerful bark stopping Jax in his tracks. "Enough," a commanding voice shouted from the hallway. The police had arrived, their weapons drawn as they entered the apartment. "Step back, hands where we can see them." Jax hesitated, his eyes darting between the officers and Scout, who still stood protectively in front of Michael. Finally, he raised his hands, his face a mask of fury and defeat. The officers moved quickly, cuffing Jax and his accomplices as they read them their rights. One of the officers approached Michael, his voice calm. "Are you okay, sir?" Michael nodded, his hand resting on Scout's head. "We're fine, thanks to Scout." The officer glanced at the German shepherd, admiration evident in his expression. "That's one incredible dog you've got there." Michael smiled faintly, his hand stroking Scout's fur. "He's more than that. He's my partner, my protector, my best friend." As the officers escorted Jax and his gang out of the apartment, the tension in the air began to lift. Scout's body relaxed slightly, his sharp eyes still scanning the room for any lingering threats. Michael knelt beside him, wrapping his arms around the dog in a rare show of vulnerability. "You did it, Scout," Michael whispered. "You kept me safe, just like you always do." Scout wagged his tail once, his eyes softening as he leaned into Michael's embrace. For the first time that night, Michael felt a sense of peace. The storm had passed, and they had weathered it together. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Michael knew he and Scout would face them side by side, their bond unbreakable.